Late one summer afternoon, Sir Topham Hatt, the controller of the North West Railway, was waiting at Kirk Ronan station. He watched as Eric brought his train up to the platform. Although he was glad to see that the large tank engine was on time, that wasn't the reason the Fat Controller was there.
"Hello, sir,"
Eric said, slightly surprised to see the Fat Controller. "Hello, Eric."
"I thought you were on holiday, sir. That's what Gordon told me at Croven's Gate."
"That's correct, Eric. I'm actually here to meet two of your passengers," replied the Fat Controller. It was the first proper holiday he'd taken in a few years, and he'd decided to do so when his eldest son, Richard, had informed him he'd be returning from Cambridge for the summer holidays. A moment later, Richard joined his father on the platform. Father and son greeted each other, then Richard glanced back at the coaches.
"I couldn't find Emily. She must be on the train. Her suitcase was in the baggage car,"
he said. A second later, a blonde-haired teenage girl joined Richard and his father.
"Hello, Dad. Ricky?"
Richard smiled warmly at his little sister.
"It's good to see you again, Emily."
As Eric moved off to take on water, Emily glanced over at her father.
"You said we'd be staying with Grandad tonight, Dad?"
She asked. "Yes, he's looking forward to seeing you two again. Although I thought we might take in the pier here first." With that, the three Hatts departed. A few hours later, the Hatts left the Kirk Ronan pier, heading for Sir Topham's retirement cottage at Kelsthorpe Road. They had had a fantastic time at the sideshows there, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bothering Richard.
"How's university life treating you, Richard?"
Emily asked. It was Richard's third year at Cambridge, studying a dual degree in business and information technology.
"Oh, fairly well. My last exams were last week. It's such a relief to get them out of the way."
"I can imagine it would be," said the Fat Controller. Soon, they reached a cottage by the railway line, where Sir Charles Topham Hatt was waiting for them. Sir Topham greeted his family warmly, then turned to the Fat Controller. "Stephen, how is Helen doing?" he asked. Helen Margaret Hatt, the Fat Controller's wife, had been taken ill yesterday. "She's much better, thank you, Dad. However, she still didn't feel up to coming down today. She insisted that we go ahead, though." "I'm glad to hear she's feeling better," replied Sir Topham. With that, the four Hatts turned and headed into the cottage. It was almost time for dinner. Early the next morning, Emily found Richard in the cottage's garden, watching trains go by.
"You're up early,"
she said.
"It's just a habit,"
Richard replied, and he glanced back out towards the railway.
"You told me a few times that train watching helps you think things through."
"So you do have something on your mind. I had a feeling you might."
Richard sighed.
"Yes, basically, Emily. You know I'm doing a dual degree in business and IT.
"Yes,"
Emily replied, not quite sure where her brother was going with this.
Well, I don't really feel that the business part is what I want to do for the rest of my life."
Emily frowned.
"So you'd prefer to concentrate on this information technology field? Computers and that sort of stuff?"
"Yes, but I'm not sure if Dad would agree with that. I mean, he's expecting me to be the next Fat Controller. That's what his engines call him, isn't it?"
Emily chuckled.
"It's what they've called the last 3 generations of our family. Dad isn't even that plump, and Granddad's lost a bit of weight too."
"It's sort of the family tradition that worries me. Do you remember how, when I was your age, he sometimes took me down to the yards and stations with him to see how the railway operated?"
"Yes. Have you talked to Dad about this at all?"
"I'm not sure how. I mean, I can tell this means a lot to him."
"I don't think he'd be too upset, Richard. I mean, he is our father after all."
"That's easy for you to say, Emily. He doesn't really have any expectations for what you or Charlie do for your lives,"
Richard said, referring to their brother Charles, who was currently travelling in Canada. Emily sighed. She knew Richard was wrong, and that he'd need convincing. A moment later, She spotted Percy chuffing past, and an idea occurred to her.
I know someone you can talk to.
Who?
He's known Dad since he was a boy. We'll go see him after breakfast.
All right.
About half an hour later, after they'd had their breakfast, Emily and Richard headed down to Killthorpe Road Station. They were just in time to catch James's slow passenger train. A while later, James's train reached Elsbridge, and the two Hatts disembarked. Emily looked around.
He should be here in a few minutes.
Meanwhile, back at the cottage, the Fat Controller was a little worried. Emily wasn't the only one who'd noticed Richard's preoccupation yesterday, and the Fat Controller had overheard their conversation through an open window that morning. "You look worried, Stephen," said Sir Topham, as he joined his son in the garden. "I am worried, Dad," said the Fat Controller, and he explained what he'd overheard that morning. "I can see where he might have got that idea," Sir Topham replied. "After all, running the railway has become a bit of a family tradition." "Well, yes, but I'm not going to force Richard into this." The Fat Controller paused for a moment. "Although I did think he would take over from me. This is the first I've heard anything to the contrary." Sir Topham smiled, reassuringly. "I wouldn't worry about that yet, Stephen. You've got a good few years to go before you should even consider retirement. Even then, I don't think you'll have to look too far from the tree, so to speak." The Fat Controller nodded, taking note of his father's advice. "All the same, I think I had better talk to Richard." "Do you know where they went?" Sir Topham asked. "I've got a fairly good idea," replied the Fat Controller, and he departed. Back at Elsbridge, Emily looked around excitedly as a familiar bell sounded out through the air.
Here he comes now.
Richard frowned, puzzled, as he spotted the approaching engine.
Toby?
As I said, he's known Dad since he was a young boy.
Richard chuckled, and Toby stopped at the platform a moment later. The tram engine smiled as he spotted Emily.
Hello, Emily.
He said warmly.
Have you come for one of your cab rides?
Not exactly, Toby. This is my brother, Richard Topham Hatt. I think he needs to talk something through.
Toby glanced over. He'd seen Richard around before, but it was the first time they'd been properly introduced.
Nice to meet you, Richard. Emily's told me a bit about you.
She has?
We're friends, Richard, ever since I had that little run-in with the BMW. You know, when I was staying at Aunt Bridget's a few months ago.
Before Richard could reply, the guard's whistle rang out.
You'd better climb aboard, Richard, if you need to talk.
Spurred on by an encouraging nod from Emily, Richard swung up into Toby's cab. A moment later, the tram engine departed.
Would I be right in assuming there's something on your mind, Richard?
Toby asked.
It's sort of a personal matter.
I understand. I'll keep it between us, and so will my crew.
Richard explained his predicament, while Toby listened carefully.
If I may say so, I think you may have it a bit wrong. I've seen the way your dad looks after us engines. I mean, he does expect us to meet certain standards, but he's very understanding when we can't. Do you know about the time Diesel went on strike in 1984?
Yes. I was only 12 at the time, but Dad told me the story.
Your father didn't just tell Diesel to get back to work. He knew Diesel had his reasons, accepted those and made a fair decision. Just like you have your reasons for wanting to focus on information technology.
You've got a point there.
Are you sure these expectations aren't something you're sort of projecting onto him?
Could be,
Richard replied. He fell silent, lost in thought. A few minutes later, Toby reached Dryor. Richard climbed down onto the platform.
Thank you, Toby. You've given me a lot to think about.
I'm glad I could help,
replied the tram engine. He then chuffed off, leaving a thoughtful Richard Hatt behind him. About 5 minutes later, Thomas arrived, heading in the opposite direction. Richard took a seat in Annie and gazed thoughtfully out the window as the blue tank engine departed. While all this had been going on, the Fat Controller had made his way to Elsbridge Station.
Dad? What brings you here?
The same thing that brought you here. I had my window open this morning, and your conversation with Richard drifted in. I thought you might be here.
Oh.
Emily replied. A moment later, a whistle sounded out, and Thomas steamed in. Richard climbed down from Annie, joining his father and sister on the platform.
Dad, there's something we need to talk about.
He paused, for a moment.
I don't really find the business side of my studies that interesting. I rather concentrate on information technology.
I understand. But I do have one question. Do you think there's a good future for somebody in that area of expertise?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a company called Microsoft doing something interesting with operating systems. I think it's really going to take off.
Richard paused for a moment.
So, when you took me down to the stations and yards when I was a teenager...
I just wanted to see if you were interested, Richard. That's all.
Richard blinked.
Oh.
He said, feeling slightly sheepish. In hindsight, he should have had this conversation earlier.
Don't worry about it,
said the Fat Controller.
It's sorted now.
Yeah.
Come on, Richard. We've got a vacation to enjoy.
Emily put in. Richard chuckled, feeling relaxed for the first time since he'd left Cambridge.
Indeed,
agreed the Fat Controller.